The First World War was the primary catastrophe of the 20th century. It saw the deaths of millions on and off the battlefield. It witnessed mass slaughter on an industrial scale, from the Far East to the North Atlantic, from the frozen wastes of Russia to the burning sands of the Middle East. Steel-clad navies pummeled each other. U-boats nearly brought Britain to her knees. Pilots were killed in flimsy aircraft over the Western Front, just as men from all around the world went over the top to be cut down in their millions in the dreaded no man's land. Despite the global losses and suffering, and ignoring the mind-boggling numbers that can be listed referencing the First World War, at its heart, it was a war which destroyed individuals and tore families apart. One of the millions of individuals that had their lives shattered was one Rudyard Kipling. Kipling, along with being a reporter and a writer, was perhaps most famous for his poetry, not to mention being the author of The Jungle Book. Rudyard Kipling's life was ravaged by torment and loss. He lost his daughter when she was only 6, but it was the death of his son John which affected him most. As an imperialist and a patriot, Kipling was keen for his son to join up as soon as the First World War started. But despite his father's efforts and organising propaganda for the British government, John was rejected by the Royal Navy due to severe short-sightedness. Undeterred, he attempted to sign up for the army, but like the Navy, he was still rejected. But it's not what you know, it's who you know. And Kipling was friends with Frederick Roberts, who was previously Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Colonel of the Irish Guards. With these connections, John Kipling received a commission as a lowly second lieutenant in the 2nd Battalion of the Irish Guards, a couple of days before he turned 17. No matter John's wishes and beliefs, after the reported rape of Belgium and the sinking of the Lusitania, Kipling was convinced the war had become a crusade against Germanic barbarism. These acts of unspeakable malice made Kipling more determined for his young son to see action and to do his duty. Training for John was brief, and he was soon in France with the 2nd Guards Brigade. But even before John had arrived, however, his father Rudyard was in France in the role of a war correspondent. John's service and life were to prove tragically short, however. In September of 1915, the British launched their assault at the Battle of Loos. Evidence is sketchy at best, but it appears that John Kipling was last seen assaulting an enemy position, staggering blinded from side to side with what appeared to be a head injury. Another report states he had been shot in the mouth and had been laid down in a shell crater by a sergeant. The tragic loss of young John Kipling was certainly not an isolated event. The British Army suffered 50,000 casualties during the Battle of Loos. Very soon after the battle, the Kiplings received the dreaded telegram from the War Office, stating their son was wounded and presumed missing. Kipling apparently knew what the note really meant, that their son had been killed. But his wife continued to believe that one day their son would return. The death of John broke Kipling, and he was forever haunted by the guilt of the fact that it was he himself who coerced his son into joining up. In memory of his son and the hundreds of thousands of men who had died in the service of their country, Kipling wrote his most famous poem, Have You News of My Boy Jack? Now this poem is about another young boy who died doing his duty. A boy like his son, but this one was in the Navy. But we do not have to look too hard to see this is essentially for his long-lost beloved John. The poem commemorates the heroism of Jack Cornwell, a 16-year-old boy who served on the light cruiser HMS Chester at the Battle of Jutland. Despite his ship being pummeled by enemy fire, his crew killed all around him, and himself mortally wounded, he remained at his post. He was brought back to England after the battle, but sadly, eventually died from his wounds. Jack Cornwell, posthumously awarded a Victoria Cross, was one of the many who died on that grim day. The Battle of Jutland, which was claimed as a victory both by the British Grand Fleet and the German High Sea Fleet, it involved 250 ships and over 100,000 men. At the end of this savage fight, 6,000 British and 2,500 German sailors were dead. The use of the name Jack in the poem's title not only referred to the main character of Jack Cornwell, but the generic term for all sailors at the time, Jack Tar. So this poem was for his son, Jack Cornwell as well, and all the sailors and soldiers who served and died fighting for Kipling's beloved Britain. Have you news of my boy Jack? Not this tide. When do you think that he'll come back? Not with this wind blowing and this tide. Has anyone else had word of him? Not this tide. For what is sunk will hardly swim, not with this wind blowing and this tide. Oh dear, what comfort can I find? None this tide, nor any tide, except he did not shame his kind, not even with that wind blowing and that tide. Then hold your head up all the more, this tide and every tide, because he was the son you bore, and gave to that wind blowing and that tide. Kipling would carry the guilt of his son's death to his very grave. Right up until his own death in 1936, Kipling never found his son's grave. During these bleak years, and ravaged by the memories of his lost son, he wrote the infamous lines, "If any ask us why we died, tell them because our fathers lied." John Kipling's body was finally identified in 1992 in St Mary's Dressing Station Cemetery near Loos. The engraved headstone is now there for all to see. We hope you've enjoyed this look at one of Britain's most famous writers and the tragedy he experienced. To see how the dead and the wounded of the First World War affected communities back in Britain, click here. Thanks for watching.